Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends. Welcome back to r/entitled people, where you'll hear outrageous stories about people who believe that the world truly does revolve around them and that nobody else matters. Guys, I hope you're having a great day today, and you know the drill. You're about to hear some crazy stories. With that said, let's dive in, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for future stories. I used to fly for work a lot. I have so many entitled people stories that it stops surprising me. This is one such story. So being someone that used to fly a lot, I was often upgraded to business class, first class, or simply just upgraded seats using miles. Since this specific flight was a connection for me, I arrived and got on the plane later than most. As soon as I walked on the plane, I saw somebody was sitting in my seat since I'd been upgraded. Now, if you fly enough, someone sitting in your seat is not an uncommon occurrence. So I said, "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." The entitled person does not even bother looking up at me, as he waves his hand dismissively at me and says, "Let's just switch seats, so I can sit beside my wife." Now, at the moment, I was feeling kinda nice, so I decided to give up my seat upgrade and said, "Sure, what's your seat?" Now, I don't remember exactly what seat number he said, but it was the last row of the airplane, right by the bathroom. Now, do remember that my assigned seat was in the business class section. Now, I've often switched seats with people many times in my life without a second thought. I've often given up my seat to somebody else to give them the experience of flying first class, but the way this guy was behaving and what he was expecting, this was not one of those times. I told him, "No, I'm just gonna sit in my assigned seat." And now he finally looks at me and says, "Well, I want to sit by my wife, so I'm not moving." I told him, "Well, if you want to sit with your wife, I'm sure whoever's sitting back there would be more than happy to switch seats with you so they can sit up here in business class." And he did not like that at all. He just stared at me, not saying a single word. At this point, I'm annoyed and said, "Sir, please move." And he said he's not moving, so I pushed the call button. The flight attendant comes and asks what's going on. I hand her my ticket and say that he's sitting in my seat. She asks for his ticket, checks both tickets, sees his seat number, and, in my mind at least, gave him the look of, "Seriously?" She then tells him, "Sir, you need to sit in your assigned seat." The man holds his ground and says, "I want to sit beside my wife." Well, I wasn't missing a beat, and parroted my original statement about me being sure that whoever was sitting back there beside him would be more than happy to switch seats and sit up here. And boy, oh boy, that made him so angry. The flight attendant then looks at his wife and says, "Ma'am, would you like to switch seats and move back there so you can sit beside your husband?" And she said, "No." The flight attendant continues in that all too familiar flight attendant voice that lets you know you have no choice. And she says, "Well, sir, you have to sit in your assigned seat, so please gather your things and move." Now, let me tell you, what a sad and pathetic sight it was seeing this grown man act like a baby. He actually huffed and acted like a 5-year-old and kept looking at me trying to guilt trip me. He gathered his things and then sulked towards the back of the plane, dragging his feet loudly the whole way. His wife sat beside me that flight and didn't join her husband in the back of the plane. And no, we did not talk or look at each other even once, which was perfectly fine with me. Guys, imagine expecting somebody to give up their first class seat and sit in the very last row of the airplane by the bathroom. What in the world was this man thinking? So while reading the story, I was really confused why one person booked the first class seat and the other got the seat at the back of the plane. And then I saw this comment. This person says, "I've heard of people doing this to try to score a free upgrade. One person gets a first class ticket while the other gets a bottom of the barrel economy seat and begs for a swap to be with family." I do wonder how often that really works though. Can anybody who's had experience with this particular situation please let me know if this works? I'm asking for my friend Karen. So, because the groundhog had no shadow, spring came early, so I decided to weed the garden strip that borders mine and my neighbor Karen's property. I want to note that there's a fence between the garden and her house. While doing so, I get rid of some of my daylilies that are on my property. I finish, return to my house, and continue my day, until I hear a shriek from the side of my house. Now, I rush over because I'm scared that somebody got hurt, and Karen, who just gets home from work, asked me why I got rid of her lilies. I clarified that they were my lilies because they're on my side, and that I was making space for tomatoes, cucumbers, and carrots. She then calls the police, saying that I had destroyed her property. The police come and basically tell her to go inside and shut up because it's pretty clear whose flowers they were. Now, I wish it ended there, but it didn't. I decided to get cameras along my property facing the garden, just in case she did something malicious to my garden or decided that those veggies belonged to her, like my lilies. Now, I didn't expect Karen to do this. Karen gets mega drunk that night during a gathering, like multiple cases of beer drunk, and I guess that put her anger over the edge about the loss of her lilies. She went with wood and fire starter to my neighbor's house, the one on the opposite side of her house than mine, and decided to light their garbage bins on fire, thinking they were my garbage bins. This spread to their porch, and their entire home was alight. Now, I'm a light sleeper, and living in a cul-de-sac was woken up by the orange haze floating through my windows. I called 911 the whole shebang, and as I went out with the 911 operator on the phone, she gives a confession. So after a while, and as the fire department shows up, she realizes her mistake. Number 1, she accidentally lit a house on fire, and number 2, she lit the wrong house on fire. As of now, she's being charged with arson. Luckily, everybody got out. There's a mother, a father, and 2 kids who are high schoolers. It still feels surreal. Those poor neighbors. Guys, I hope she got charged with a lot more than arson, because clearly she was super intoxicated and wanted to target OP and burn her place down, with her inside of it. All of this over some lilies that didn't belong to her in the first place. Some people are just way too crazy, guys. They really are. On our property, we have a couple of hundred cars and motor vehicles stored at any given time. Now, the neighborhood we lived in wasn't the best, and sometimes teens like to break in and steal personal items left in cars, like wallets, radios, GPS units, etc. If they stole the radio out of the dash, they'd rip the dash apart, so we'd have to replace the radio and repair the dash, which was a very expensive repair. We had a 6-foot-high fence topped with razor wire and an alarm, and they'd always find ways to get over it. Usually, they'd throw a mattress on the razor wire and hop over using a car. To protect ourselves, we decided to put up an electric fence inside of our security fence to give us double the protection. The electric fence was 6 feet inside the outer fence. The neighborhood parents decided that they were up in arms about our complete disregard for their crotch trophies. The local councilman and the police lieutenant came over asking me what we could do to calm the neighbors. Mind you, the electric fence was installed with the blessing of the local government. It's fully permitted and licensed. I told the politician that we would not be disarming or removing the fence. He told me that the neighbors were overly concerned for their kids. I asked him which neighbors were the most vocal. He told me, and then I looked at the lieutenant and told him that those were the kids they have to investigate when there's theft in the area. I told him the parents that were most worried about their kids were the ones that had kids that they knew were climbing the fence and stealing and vandalizing cars. Then I took them to show them the fence. Now, you would seriously think that the councilman would have taken a closer look at the setup, but he only looked at the big yellow high voltage warning signs. When we got to the storage facility, the lieutenant laughed, and the councilman was surprised. He was mad and surprised at the same time. They looked at the setup. The electric fence, as I said, was 6 feet inside the property. There was no way to accidentally contact it from the sidewalk. The only way to get to it and shock yourself would be to climb the outer security fence and take 2 to 3 steps to the fence. There's no reason that any kids should get shocked. The kids weren't allowed in there, ever, under any circumstances. It didn't take long for the councilman to learn that he had been played by the neighbors. The lieutenant was fairly entertained, and he actually laughed. I looked at the lieutenant and we talked about the families that were really upset about the fence. They outed themselves as the suspects in a number of crimes. The lieutenant chuckled and said, "Now I have to figure out what to say to the parents of these crooks." I said to tell them that I want to know if they prefer their delinquents regular or extra crispy. Guys, this is absolutely ridiculous. Imagine the whole neighborhood banding together to get upset at you for trying to protect your property and valuables. OP is 100% right. The only reason those parents would get upset is that if they knew their kids were climbing into OP's property to begin with. Ugh, I can hear those entitled parents right now. How dare you not make it safe for my kids to commit vandalism and theft? You monster. Is that right? That sounds about right, right? So, Australia has some hectic wildfires going on right now and is suffering an extreme drought. My hometown has high water restrictions in place, so things like washing your car and watering your garden are a massive no-no. The water supply is scary low, and there's been talk about the council potentially needing to pay for water trucks to fill it. So even though I live in another city and my parents have moved to the coast, they still own the house that we grew up in and have been trying to sell it, so it's been sitting empty for about 6 months. We have friends who occasionally check up on it to make sure there's nothing stolen and to mow the lawns. So you can imagine the shock when they received a water bill for $500. My dad went back there on Wednesday to check it out, and they found that our neighbor has removed one of the pickets from the fence and has been feeding a hose from our yard to her yard from our backyard tap. Her backyard is like a tropical oasis. Vibrant green lawn, blooming flowers, a giant inflatable pool full of water, while everybody else's lawn around is brown and dead. The bill says the amount of water used was about 200,000 liters. He's taken photos of her lawn and the removed picket on the fence and reported her to the council. My dad's a lawyer, so he's looking into what she did and contacting a few of his friends about the situation, so she's absolutely screwed. We can't believe that in such a time of crisis as the land burns around us, all she cares about is her own garden. Now guys, this does not surprise me at all. It's unfortunate that these people do exist, but hey, if we didn't have these people, we wouldn't get to hear these wacky stories now, would we? So this happened almost 5 years ago, and I just got notice yesterday that my entitled Aunt Karen had died, and got a call from her husband asking me to attend the funeral next weekend. I declined, as did my older brother Mark. Karen was my mother's older sister, and she constantly interfered with my mother and her children's lives. She never did like my father, and always tried to tell my mother that she made a mistake by marrying him. She also did not like the name my parents picked out for my older brother. She would often criticize my brother and my choice of friends, and even complained when I started to play softball, because proper ladies don't play sports, and if her daughter ever played a sport, she would have her removed from the team. Now spoiler, she never did have any kids. So the day after my 16th birthday, my parents drove down to California for a business trip. They never did make it back, because on the drive to California, they got into a car accident and died. Their will split everything evenly between my brother and I. At the funeral, the production manager of my parents' company, Tim, was talking to my brother, and my brother told him that in a couple of weeks, he would step in and take over. He was counting on Tim to run things smoothly until then, and help him take it over and learn the ropes. Now, I had no interest in the business, other than it was a guaranteed summer job when I was growing up. So I just stayed out of it and collected my profit checks, until I sold my half to Mark, who continues to run the business to this day. One day, Aunt Karen shows up and began putting her stuff in my parents' office, and when Tim confronts her about this, she said his services were no longer needed and he was fired. So Tim called Mark up, and Mark went down with a family attorney, some police, and the necessary paperwork and had her removed. Aunt Karen said the place was now hers, because it was her sister's, so she was now the owner. As long as I've known her, she's never had a steady job and has had 3 husbands and milked each one for as much as she could get before divorcing him. The next day, as I was leaving for school, I saw her car and a moving van parked outside. I asked her what she was doing, and she said she was moving into her house and said in a sickly sweet voice that for rent, she would continue to allow me to stay there until I graduated high school. I went in and called my brother, and he showed up with the family attorney, the police, and all the paperwork, and had her removed from the property. Mark gave me a number, and told me that if I ever saw Aunt Karen on or near the property, to call that number and report her immediately. Don't even try to confront her or give her a warning, just call. Eventually, Karen moved to Colorado, where I assume she met and married the man who called me and said she died. He couldn't find anyone from her family to attend the funeral. I chose not to tell him anything about her and said, "Sorry for your loss, but I can't make it." From discussions with Mark, he basically told him the same thing. Outside of myself, Mark, and Mark's infant daughter, I don't think she has any living relatives. I still own the house, but sleep in my own bedroom. I go to local university and still miss my parents and think about them every day. And even though I'm 21 years old and own a large home, have money in the bank, I would trade it all away to have my parents back. Entitled family members are the worst, as some of you may already know. And the fact that she swooped in during a time of grieving and just made things way harder on the kids was absolutely ridiculous. Clearly, she does not know how a will works. You can't just come in and decide that things belong to you now because they once belonged to your sister. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /entitled people. Guys, thanks for coming to hang out with me again today, and I hope you guys enjoyed the stories. If you missed the last episode, I'll link it right here. An entitled man trespasses on OP's property and tries to get her arrested. It's such a ridiculous story, so check it out if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next one. I love you.